Well, greetings again, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for recreational flyers. My name is Kevin Morris, and I'm an aviation safety inspector with the FAA and also a subject matter expert on drone operations. Today's webinar will be divided into two segments. First will be a presentation on the latest updates for recreational flyers, and the second portion will provide an opportunity to have your questions answered live on the air. I'm joined by a team of FAA subject matter experts who are ready to answer your questions. And you can submit your questions at any time during today's webinar. If we are unable to get to your question during the webinar, don't worry. We will be answering all questions asked during the webinar and posting them to our website in the coming weeks. So let's begin. As you probably know by now, there have been changes to the rules regarding recreational flying. Today, we want to help you understand what those changes are, how you can still fly today, and what responsibilities you have as a recreational flyer. These changes came about through the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act, where Congress mandated certain requirements for people flying drones for fun under the exception for limited recreational operations. Now, not all of Congress's requirements could be immediately implemented. Therefore, the FAA published interim safety guidance for recreational flyers in an advisory circular. And you can download that advisory circular in the handout section of this webinar. It explains how to operate now until the FAA can implement all the requirements of the Reauthorization Act. More information is available on our website at faa.gov/UAS. Now, I've been using the term recreational flyer quite a bit, so let me explain what that really means. Recreational flying is flying any unmanned aircraft, drone, quadcopter, or RC airplane for purely recreational purposes, meaning you're flying just for fun. It does not include any flights in furtherance of business, regardless if money is being exchanged or not. If you are flying in connection with any business-related activity, including nonprofits, you must operate under Part 107, also known as the Small UAS Rule. Okay, so now that we have all that cleared up, let's talk about recreational drone flying. Before you fly your drone, if it weighs 0.55 pounds or more, you must register it. If you are at least 13 years old, you can register yourself as a recreational flyer with the FAA for $5. Registration is valid for 3 years, and if you have more than one drone you fly recreationally, you can use the same registration number on all of them. Remember, the registration number must be visible on an outside surface of the drone. Well, now that you've registered your drone, you're going to need to follow some basic safety guidelines. First, never fly over groups of people or stadiums full of people. And never fly near emergency operations. This is very important. During emergency operations, it's important that public safety officials and the FAA know exactly what aircraft are in the air and where they are located. If you fly your drone near these operations, they will ground their aircraft and not be able to do their job. This can be particularly devastating during wildfire emergencies. And it should go without saying, but you should never fly under the influence of alcohol or drugs. You also need to know the airspace you're planning to fly in. Generally speaking, there are two types of airspace recreational flyers need to be aware of: uncontrolled and controlled. Uncontrolled airspace is airspace in which air traffic control is not required to provide their services to aircraft. But just because it's called uncontrolled doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. There are still rules to follow. For recreational flyers, you may fly in uncontrolled airspace up to 400 feet above ground level. There is no airspace authorization required, and you no longer need to notify airport operators if you're flying within 5 miles of an airport. To fly in controlled airspace, you must have an airspace authorization before you fly. So let's talk about what that means for you. There are three ways a recreational flyer can be authorized to operate in controlled airspace: by flying at an FAA approved fixed recreational flying site, through the low altitude authorization and notification capability or LANC system, or by using the Drone Zone web portal. And currently, LANC and Drone Zone are not available for recreational flyers. Therefore, to operate in controlled airspace today, you'll need to fly at an FAA approved fixed recreational flying site. Recreational flyers should not contact air traffic control or the tower directly for airspace authorizations. And here's some big news. We are announcing for the first time right now that LANC, the low altitude authorization and notification capability, will be operational for recreational flyers on July 23rd this year. That's only 3 short weeks away. Recreational flyers will be able to request and receive their authorizations in near real time from companies approved by the FAA to provide LANC services. These companies are known as FAA approved UAS service suppliers and are listed on our website. Our web-based portal, Drone Zone, is also being updated to accept requests from recreational flyers, and it will be available at a later time. For now, until LANC becomes operational for recreational flyers, the only way you can fly in controlled airspace is at an FAA approved fixed recreational flying site. The sites are represented as blue dots on UAS facility maps and will continue to exist even after LANC becomes operational. You can also find a list of approved fixed sites on the FAA webpage. If UAS facility maps and LANC are new to you, good news. We will be hosting 2 webinars dedicated to these topics in July and August. When you are flying at a fixed recreational flying site, you must still comply with all the rules for recreational flyers. In addition to those rules, there may be specific rules that the flying site uses, which you also need to follow. This is because in order for a flying site to receive approval, they must have a mutually agreed upon operating procedure established with the local air traffic facility. Those mutually agreed upon procedures must be followed by all users of that site. Now, you're all set to fly, but wait, one more very important thing. Before you fly, make sure there are no airspace restrictions in your area. There could be a temporary flight restriction or TFR issued for where you want to fly. TFRs are established for safety and security reasons and typically exist for limited periods of time. Large outdoor sporting events are also included in many TFRs. You also might find that your location is inside prohibited or restricted airspace designed to protect the safety and security of certain locations and events. The Know Before You Fly website and the Before You Fly app are great resources to help you identify where current airspace restrictions exist. Okay, so your drone is registered, you're going to follow safety guidelines, you've checked the airspace, you might be asking, can I go fly now? And the answer is yes, it's time to go fly. But keep in mind, when you're flying, there are some in-flight rules you need to be aware of. First, at all times, you must keep your aircraft within visual line of sight. This means you must be able to physically see the drone that you're flying. There is a provision for all you first-person view or FPV flyers out there. You can fly FPV as long as you have someone located physically next to you and who can communicate with you without using technology like a cell phone or a radio. We call that person a visual observer. So either the person flying the drone or the visual observer must have the aircraft within visual line of sight at all times. Keeping your drone within visual line of sight allows you to stay away from any manned aircraft that may be flying near you. When you fly, you're required to avoid all manned aircraft, airplanes, helicopters, gliders, ultralights, etc. It's your responsibility as a recreational flyer to know the altitude and position of your drone in relation to other aircraft, including emergency response aircraft. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the FAA is working to implement all the congressional requirements of the 2018 Reauthorization Act. We are developing a process for recognizing community-based organizations, or CBOs. Those organizations that meet the statutory requirements will be formally recognized by the FAA, and they will have approved safety guidelines for recreational flyers to follow. They will also have approved procedures to operate large or advanced model aircraft. Another IOU we have is the Aeronautical Knowledge and Safety Test. When ready, passing this test will be required to fly any drone or RC aircraft for recreational purposes. We are developing this test, which will include training material in consultation with industry and the general public. Once the test is available, you will need to provide documentation that you took and passed the test if asked by FAA personnel or law enforcement. So I want to thank you for joining us for our presentation today. I know that was a lot of information, but you'll be able to rewatch this episode and all of our previous webinars on our official FAA YouTube channel at youtube.com/FAA news. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, July 18th, and will cover the low altitude authorization and notification capability system. If you want to know our complete webinar schedule, please visit faa.gov/go/drone webinar. And as always, we have additional resources available to you on our website at faa.gov/UAS. So we're going to take a short break right now, but please stick around, because when we come back from our break, we'll be taking your questions live on the air. If you'd like your question read on the air, simply submit your question with the word live, L-I-V-E, in front of that question, and we'll put it into the queue to be asked live on the air. So don't go anywhere. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Okay, we're back and we're ready to start our live Q&A portion here. As I mentioned previously before the break, if you have a question you'd like read live on the air, please submit it into the question box there with GoToWebinar, and it'll be routed to me and we'll get to that question. We do have a couple coming in right away. I just want to remind you folks that if you don't want your question read live on the air, that's okay too. Our FAA subject matter experts are still available, and you can still type in your question and they will get to it as quickly as possible. So one of the first questions I have here coming in is clarify what you mean by flying over people. This question comes up a lot, and the best way to answer it is this: flying over a person is really what the word says, over the person. So if you imagine kind of an imaginary cylinder around somebody, and if that drone were to pass through that imaginary cylinder that encompasses their body, then if it flew through that cylinder, that would be over that person. Now, if you get a bunch of people together in a group, then of course that imaginary cylinder probably gets a little bit bigger. So flying over someone is literally flying over the top of them, or over the top of where they happen to be. Let's say if they're lying down in a field, that cylinder would be larger than if they were standing vertically. But just because you may not be flying over somebody doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful. Remember, as a pilot and flying a remote aircraft, you always want to be careful of where the wind is or other factors that if you were to lose control of your unmanned aircraft, that it might fly into somebody. We want to avoid those situations. So the question is, what do you mean by flying over people? It means directly over somebody, but always take into account external factors, environment like wind, weather, things like that, the speed of which you're flying your aircraft, the direction that you're flying it, to make sure that it's not aimed towards anyone. So that's a good question. I really do appreciate that. Another question coming in here, if I were to fly a drone to capture images for a nonprofit organization, and that nonprofit organization were to use my images to promote their charity events, does that change my status to commercial, even if I do not accept money? So to really answer this question, and it's a great question because it comes up a lot, we want to focus on what was your intent when you flew that drone. Remember, recreational flying is just that. It's flying for recreational purposes. You are flying the aircraft just for fun. Anytime you go up to fly your UAS that's in connection with the business, even if it's a nonprofit, for example, in the question there, the scenario was, I'm going to go fly my drone to get some images for a nonprofit, and they're going to use that to promote their charity events. That would fall under the small UAS rule, Part 107, because your intent of flying that aircraft on that particular scenario was not purely recreational purposes. You were going up, you had a mission, it was tied in with the business, even if you're not being paid any money. So that's very important for you to understand, that the exchange of money is not what determines whether or not your flight would be recreational or not. It's the intent of what you're doing. And anytime you're flying, if it's not strictly for fun, then you're going to be operating underneath the small UAS rule, Part 107. So very good questions there. Looking to see if we have some more questions rolling in. I don't see any coming in right now, or at least they haven't been sent to me yet. But some of the questions that we do have coming up relate to operating in Class G, and where is Class G? Airspace, when we break it down, is broken down into Class Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. And during this webinar, I really try to simplify that and keep it in terms of controlled and uncontrolled. But if you want to find out more about airspace, we do have a YouTube series, a playlist that's dedicated to explaining what airspace is and how that classification system works. But really, for terms of recreational flying, if you go and rewatch this webinar, it'll give you a pretty good idea of when you should and when you should not need an airspace authorization to fly. Okay, so some more questions coming in. Numerous articles on the internet indicate that the FAA has sole jurisdiction. Oh, I love these questions. Has sole jurisdiction on airspace at the altitudes that recreational drones can operate. How are parks, cities, and the Park Service able to prohibit the takeoff, operation, or landing of drones? To answer this question, which is another very good question, you really have to divide it into two parts: the airspace and the ground. The FAA regulates the airspace from the ground up, but cities, national parks, homeowners associations, they may be able to regulate what you're allowed to do within city limits on that ground. For example, a city could have an ordinance that states no drone may be launched or landed within city limits. And what they're doing is they're restricting what you can do within city limits. They're not restricting the airspace. They're saying you can't launch or recover a drone from our city limits. National parks follow that same type of formula, where they say you're launching or recovering drones within national parks is prohibited. I don't want to go too far down the road because I'm not an attorney, but we do have our legal counsel as part of our subject matter expert team who can help you with these questions. But essentially, cities can regulate what you can do within city limits from the ground. What they can't do is restrict you flying in the air. That again is the FAA's jurisdiction. So if you want a more detailed and more perhaps legally defensible answer, I'd ask that you put that question back in and let our legal team answer it, because they'll get you a much more comprehensive answer than I was able to provide you there. But thank you for that question. So another question comes in. There is no community drone group in my town, so I can't fly my drone. No, the requirement that you follow the safety guidelines, if you remember back from one of the first slides I showed, one of the congressional mandates was that you follow the safety guidelines of a community-based organization. Well, we don't have those defined quite yet. So what we're asking is that you follow the safety guidelines of an aero modeling organization. You do not need to be a member of that modeling organization, aero modeling organization, and you do not have to have one located in your town. What the congressional mandate requires is that you're following the safety guidelines that they've established. You can also look to our website at faa.gov/UAS. We also have safety guidelines that we've posted that you can use to fly safely. So either one, whether it's an aero modeling organization or you're following our safety guidelines, you need to be following somebody's safety guidelines, but no, they don't need to be located in your town. You do not need to be a member of that organization either. Another question here is, what's the difference now between recreational and Part 107 flyers? Well, probably the biggest difference between recreational flying and Part 107 is that if you want to get paid to fly your drone, you'll need to do that under Part 107. Another example would be a difference would be that under Part 107, let's assume that LANCE is now operational for both recreational flyers. So this is towards the end of July here. Under Part 107, you could request further coordination through LANCE to get access to maybe a 0 altitude grid in the facility map, or if the ceiling is 200 feet limited, you could request to go up to 300 feet. You won't be able to do that through LANCE as a recreational flyer. So there are some differences between the two, but I think the biggest one and the reason most people operate under Part 107 is because they can do it for commercial purposes. But I do want to mention here that although we talk a lot about commercial purposes under Part 107, you're completely okay to fly recreationally under Part 107 as well, as long as you're complying with all the requirements that Part 107 identifies. So Part 107, you can fly recreationally under Part 107 as well as commercially. So thank you for that question. So here's a question coming up here. How can I fly if my local airport is not participating in LANCE? Another good question. If your airport is not participating in LANCE, and there are a few out there, we just did a big push not too long ago to incorporate a lot of FAA contract towers into the LANCE program. So we're sort of rolling these out in batches, and more airports are getting added into LANCE. But if you happen to fly where LANCE is not available and you're a recreational flyer, you're going to need to wait until the Drone Zone web portal is up to speed to accept requests for recreational flyers. And unfortunately, I don't have a date for you right now of when Drone Zone, our web portal, will be available for you. So keep watching for that. We will announce it. Follow us on all of our social media channels. That's the best way to stay up to date on the latest information when it comes to UAS. Question coming in here. Can I fly recreational drones at night? All right. Okay, I figured that question was going to be coming sooner or later. So let me address it this way. The statute, where all of our authority to issue rules comes from, does not have any straight provisions against night flying by recreational flyers. Now, before everybody goes and runs out the door tonight and starts flying their drone around, keep in mind one of my previous comments, which is you still need to be operating under the safety guidelines of an aero modeling organization. That's still a requirement. And so the requirement for you to fly at night may include things like you must put lights on your vehicle or you must keep it so far away. You really need to do your research before you go take off and fly your drone at night. Regardless of what set of safety guidelines you might operate under, you always have to have your drone within visual line of sight, which at night becomes a little bit more difficult. Of course, it depends on the color of your drone, the size of your drone, if you have any lighting and equipment on it, things like that. But just because you're flying at night doesn't mean that you can lose visual line of sight. So keep that in mind for recreational flyers if you're flying at night. Next question coming in, does a certified drone pilot need to get permission to fly in E-class Echo airspace within 5 miles of an airport? Let me try to answer that this way. A certificated drone pilot, which we call a remote pilot, operates under Part 107. And Part 107 has almost identical airspace requirements in terms of authorization as recreational flyers now do. So if you're going to operate in Class Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or Surface Class Echo designated for an airport, yes, you will need to receive an airspace authorization before you fly, whether you're operating under Part 107 or whether you're doing that as a recreational flyer. And again, once LANCE comes on board here in late July, you'll have that same access to that. So the answer is yes, certificated remote pilots need airspace authorizations too to operate in particular controlled airspace. Another question is, where can I find the airspace map with the fixed sites? Okay, so earlier in the presentation, we did have that website. It was posted into the chat, but I'm going to ask our production crew if they wouldn't mind, go ahead and post the UAS facility map web link into the chat for everyone to see. And you can go to that website and you can pull up the UAS facility maps and you can see where all the airspace is across the US. And you're going to be looking for, the best way to describe it are little blue dots. And when you see those little blue dots, you can zoom in, you can identify where that is, who's in charge. Usually there's a website link to contact, but that'd be the way to go and find those fixed recreational flyer sites. We have a lot added right now. We are adding more every single day. There's a process to have a particular location designated as a fixed recreational flying site. And if you want more information on that, please put that question into the chat room or the question box, and we'll get that information to you folks either today or when we can get these questions posted online for you folks. So question coming in. This is another really good question. I love the questions you guys are sending in. These are all excellent, excellent questions. The question is, are you required to take both the Part 107 test and the recreational flying test? So again, keep in mind, the basic aeronautical training test or the aeronautical knowledge and safety test, whatever name you want to give it right now, is not yet available for recreational flyers. So I'm going to repeat that. Right now, there is no test available for recreational flyers to take. That is being developed, and at a later date, it will be a requirement. We are working on trying to address that issue. So the question of, oh, I took my Part 107 knowledge test, I have a remote pilot certificate, can't I just use that as evidence as completing a test? We're working through some of that. The language in the statute doesn't specifically state that that test would qualify. In fact, it very clearly states that if you're going to fly recreationally, you must pass an aeronautical knowledge and safety test. So we're looking at how that's going to work in. One of the things to keep in mind is that as a recreational flyer, there are some differences, some nuanced differences in the rule that 107 doesn't have. For example, 107, you're limited to weight. Well, under recreational flyers, you can fly a drone that's heavier than 55 pounds once we have a community-based organization recognized with approved flying procedures. So there are some differences between 107 and recreational flyers that we want people to be aware of. But I can't give you a solid yes or no on that question right now, but it definitely is something that we're considering and that we're looking at. Another question here, are beaches off limit for recreational flying, or will LANCE enable you to fly over certain beaches? LANCE itself is an airspace function. It doesn't really matter what's on the ground underneath it. So when we're talking about LANCE and we're talking about airspace authorizations, we're talking about the airspace. So if that beach is in uncontrolled airspace, and you remember back to one of the first points I made here in the presentation, you could fly at that beach, assuming there are no local provisions against you flying a drone from that beach, but you could fly over that beach if it were an uncontrolled airspace up to 400 feet, as long as you complied with all the conditions for recreational flyers. Now, if that beach is actually part of Class Delta or controlled airspace, let's say it's really close to an airport that has a control tower or a runway, then you're going to need to receive an airspace authorization through LANCE when it comes online before you fly. So again, it's not exactly what's on the ground that's determining the airspace requirements. It's the airspace above that ground that's really determining that requirement. So thank you for that question. Do I need to re-register my drone when my registration expires? Yes, every 3 years your registration will expire and you'll need to go back into Drone Zone and update your registration profile and receive a new registration that will be valid again for 3 years. We do the same for manned aircraft. It's something that we do in order to keep all of our records up to date on who owns what aircraft and how that's working into our national airspace system. So yes, every 3 years you will need to re-register your drone. Okay, so I think I have time for one more question. I know this time flies by pretty quickly. It's been very enjoyable for me to see these questions coming in. They're excellent, very intelligent questions, so I appreciate that. The last question I'll ask here is probably a good one to wind up on. It's, can I clarify what I mean by furtherance of business? If no money is exchanged, is that still considered business? So what we're talking about here is the defining line between recreational flying and operating under Part 107, the small UAS rule. And you have to think of it in terms of this way. If you're flying your drone and the only reason you're flying is for pure fun, you're just doing this for recreational purposes, Yeah, you might be taking some photos, but that's just because you want to take some photos. That's just because you want to get some videos with your drone because you think it's really cool and you get some great pictures with it. And it's just all for fun. You're just doing this for yourself. You're going to be a recreational flyer by pretty much any stretch. If you're flying for any other reason than what I just explained, you'll need to operate under Part 107. The exchange of money has no bearing or effect on whether or not that flight would be considered recreational or be required to fly under Part 107. So keep that in mind. The big defining line is not money being exchanged. It's what you're doing when you're flying your drone. Are you doing this just for the pure enjoyment of RC aircraft flying or drone flying? Then you probably will fall underneath the exception for limited recreational operations. If not, you'll need to operate under Part 107 or the small UAS rule. So I know we have a lot of questions coming in, folks. We had a lot of people attend, and I know our production crew with our subject matter experts were going like crazy trying to get to everyone's question. Remember, if we didn't answer your question during this last half hour, we will still answer it. We will post all of those questions and the answers on our website in the FAQ here in the coming weeks. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get through all of them, but rest assured, we will answer every one that you've asked. So again, I thank you folks for joining us and taking your time out of the day to understand this subject. Remember, you can rewatch this episode once we get it posted to our YouTube channel. So I wish everyone a great weekend. Have a great holiday week next week, and remember to fly safe.